Hello and welcome back to another full step-by-step PC build guide, and today I'm going to show you how to build a PC in the latest case from Gamdias, the Athena M6 Lite. This is a budget-oriented case with a budget price. It's got an MSRP of $60 for the black version and $65 for the white version that I have here. So let's take a look at the other parts I'm going to be building with today. For the motherboard, I'm going to be using the ASRock Z790 Phantom Gaming Riptide. For the CPU, I'm going to be using Intel's 13th Gen i7, the 13700K. Keeping our CPU cool, I've got a 240mm AIO from Gelid. It's the Gelid Liquid 240. For RAM, I've got 32GB of Kingston Fury Beast RGB DDR5 at 5600 mega transfers per second. For storage, I'm going with two Gen 4 NVMe M.2 SSDs. The first is from Kingston and it's their Fury Renegade in 500GB capacity. And the second is from TEAMGROUP. It's their T-Force CARDEA A440 Pro in 1TB capacity. Powering the whole build, I've got an 850 watt fully modular gold power supply from Cooler Master. It's the V850i Gold Multi. For the graphics card, I'm going to be using the Aorus Master RTX 3070. And the final part for today's build is some blue and black cable extensions from a cable mod. Okay, time to build. So I'm going to make a start by preparing our case, and as we go I'm going to point out all the case's main features. So our tempered glass side panel is held on with two non-captive thumb screws at the back, which we need to remove. And once they've been removed, we can simply slide the panel backwards, tilt out and lift away. The other side panel, again, we've got two non-captive thumb screws at the back, which we need to remove. And then we can pull the panel backwards and lift away. Taking a look at our front I/O, we've got a power and reset button. We've got a button to cycle through the lighting effects on the case's built-in ARGB controller. We've got three USB Type A ports. Two of them are USB 2.0 ports and one is a USB 3.0 port. And then we've got a separate headphone and microphone jack. On the top of the case, we've got a magnetic dust filter which can simply be pulled away. On the front of the case, we've got a mesh panel which can simply be pulled off from the front. If we take a look at the reverse of the mesh panel we've just removed, you'll notice there's no separate dust filters, so Gamdias are going with just mesh on the front. With the front panel removed, you can see the three 120mm ARGB fans which are pre-installed at the front of the case. It is important to point out these are SATA powered fans, so you're not going to be able to adjust their speed. If you prefer at the front, you can mount up to two 140mm fans or up to a 360 or 280mm radiator. At the top of the case, you can mount up to two 120 or two 140mm fans or up to a 240mm radiator. While at the rear of the case, we've got another 120mm ARGB fan pre-installed. Alternatively, you can mount up to a 140mm fan or up to 120 or 140mm radiator. In terms of motherboard support, it's up to ITX, and if you want to go with an air cooler, you'll be pleased to hear you can fit really large coolers up to a maximum height of 190mm. We've got 7 horizontal PCIe expansion slots, and in terms of graphic card support, it's up to a maximum length of 340mm. On the bottom of the case, you can see the three ARGB lighting bars that we have that should give us some great lighting effects. And over the power supply's intake, we've got a mesh dust filter. It's just a simple piece of mesh which you can pull out for cleaning. So moving into the rear compartment, we've got cable cutouts in reasonable places, and it looks like we've got plenty of cable tie-down points. Although being a budget-oriented cases, we don't have any rubber grommets at all. We've got our case accessory bag here, so we'll go ahead and free it up. So this is everything that comes in the case accessory bag. So we've got 5 cable ties. We've got 3 additional standoffs. Now unfortunately, all the standoffs to secure an ATX motherboard are not installed. Only 6 of them are. These are additional 3 that we're going to need. But unfortunately, we don't have the standoff insertion or removal tool included in the accessory bag. We've got these larger screws for securing our power supply into place. We've got lots of these screws for securing our motherboard and 2.5-inch drives. And then we've got some screws for securing 3.5-inch drives. So taking a look at the cables coming from our 4 pre-installed fans, they're all connected up to this SATA cable. So there's no way for us to control the speeds of the fans. We will, however, be able to control the lighting effects of them using the button on the top of the case as one option. The other option is you can plug this ARGB cable into your motherboard and then you press the LED button on the top of the case for 3 seconds to get the motherboard sync, and that is going to control the lighting of all 4 of the fans and also the 3 lighting bars on the bottom of the case. So if we bring our case cables to the side, you can see we've got 2 dedicated 2.5-inch drive mounting slots here. So you're going to be able to have your drives on display in the main body of the case, and then we've got a cutout here for the I/O. And down at the bottom of the case, we've got a dedicated hard drive cage. So in the hard drive cage itself, you're going to be able to fit a 3.5-inch drive. And on the top of the drive tray, you can fit either another 3.5-inch drive or a 2.5-inch drive. This drive tray is removable. I'm not planning to install any 3.5 or 2.5 inch drives, so I'm going to remove it and make more space for our power supply and associated cables. So there's 2 screws on the bottom holding the hard drive cage in place. And then with the 2 screws removed, it should just be a simple matter of pulling the hard drive cage backwards and removing it. Our power supply is going to go down at the bottom, and the case is compatible with full-size HTX power supplies up to a maximum length of 180mm. Although if you remove the hard drive cage like we have, you've got absolutely loads of space for your power supply and associated cables. As you'd expect, in a budget-oriented case, we don't have any removable power supply bracket, so you're going to have to slide your power supply in from the side and then screw it in from the back. We're now ready to start work on the motherboard, and we're going to be installing our CPU, the bracket for our CPU cooler, our M.2 SSDs and our RAM all before we put the motherboard into the case. So we're going to need to open the socket to install our CPU, and we need to do that by pushing this lever down and out and then bring it all the way to the top of the motherboard, and then we're going to be able to open the socket cover. We can then set our CPU down into the socket, lining it up with the notches at the top and the bottom and making sure the text is the correct way up. It's often useful to give the CPU a little wiggle in the socket just to check it's properly seated, and once we're happy it is, we can then close the socket cover down. Now I found it's always easier to apply a bit of pressure here and get the black bit of plastic to pop off before closing the lever, and we're going to put this black bit of plastic in the motherboard box so we don't lose it. And then it's just a matter of closing the lever down again to secure the CPU in the socket. Next thing to install is our M.2 SSDs, and this motherboard actually has 5 M.2 SSD slots. 2 of them are behind this heatsink at the top. One is a Gen 5 and one is a Gen 4 slot, although we can only use one at any one time. And then we've got one here and another 2 behind this heatsink. So it makes sense for us to install ours in the top slot. It goes directly to the CPU, so it's going to give us the fastest speeds. And then choosing between the other 3 slots. This one doesn't have a heatsink, although our drive does have a heatsink. I think installing it directly under the GPU will heat it up a little bit. So I'd rather use the existing motherboard heatsink and install it behind here. So we're going to need to remove these 2 heatsinks. Okay, so starting off with our top slot, as I've mentioned, you've actually got 2 sockets under here. This is a Gen 5 slot and this is the Gen 4 slot. Although we've only got a Gen 4 drive, you might wonder why we don't install it in the Gen 5 slot. The problem is it shares lanes with our top PCIe slot, and if we install a Gen 5 drive, the number of lanes for our graphics card goes down from 16 to 8. If we install our drive in the Gen 4 slot, there's no sacrifices to make in terms of the graphics card, so it makes sense to install our drive in the Gen 4 slot. So our standoff is over to this side, which is the right way round. If you're wanting to install a Gen 5 drive, you would need to move this standoff over to here to secure the drive. So all we need to do is set our drive into the Gen 4 socket at a side angle and then wiggle it into place. Then what we can do is flatten the drive down, and you see the standoff is going to hold in place, and then we can use one of the M.2 screws from the motherboard box to secure it into place. If you're using the motherboard from new, you'll have some plastic protection on the back of the heatsink that you're going to need to remove. I've used this socket before, so that's why there's no plastic here. Okay, moving down to the bottom sockets, and we'll set our second M.2 drive into place. Again, we're going to flatten it down and take a screw from the motherboard box and secure it into place. So this time I do still have the plastic protection on the heatsink, so I'm going to go ahead and remove it actually from both of the slots. Next, we've got our RAM to install. We've only got 2 sticks of RAM, which means we're going to need to install it in the second and fourth slot along from the CPU. So I'm going to open the clips on these slots. Then it's just a matter of lining the RAM up with the slot, making sure we've got it the right way round. And once we're happy everything's lined up, it's just some firm pressure to the RAM and it's going to clip into place. And then the same thing with our second stick, line it up with the slot. And again, once we're happy everything's in the right way round, a bit of firm pressure and it'll clip into place. So the next thing for us to do is assemble the backplate for our CPU cooler. So we've got mounting holes for AMD, which are these ones, and if we turn the bracket over, these ones are labelled for Intel. So what we need to do is pass these little silver pins through the bracket, and you'll notice once they're in here, they're going to be able to slide up and down on the bracket. And then what we're going to want to do is take one of these yellow covers and push them over, and we're going to pull the pin all the way down into the yellow cover. And then it's just the same thing to do for each of the other corners. Okay, so that's all the yellow clips in place. And actually for each corner, there's 3 different settings that we have. We can have the pin all the way towards the outside, in the middle, or towards the middle of the bracket. And for the LJ1700 socket, we want to have it in the middle. And to adjust them, you can either push the bracket all the way in like this, and then to slide it out, you just need to loosen these pins slightly to get it to go out to the next setting. So I'm just going to push them all to the middle setting. So what I'd recommend doing at this stage is sizing it up with the back of the motherboard to check that it fits, which I've done, and we've currently got all these in the right place. So we can then go ahead and remove the protection from the adhesive. And then it's just a matter of lining the bracket up with the back of the motherboard. And then if we apply a little bit of pressure, the adhesive is going to stick. So just before we put the motherboard into the case, you'll notice that only 6 of our standoffs have been put in place. There's another 3 in the case accessory box that we're going to have to put over here in line with the existing standoffs. Now, unfortunately, Gamdias don't include the standoff insertion and removal tool to insert these into the case. So what you would need to do is put them into the hole, and you'll notice they're actually quite stiff if you try and put them in by hand. If you don't have the tool, what you can do is actually get a pair of pliers and try and turn them that way. I have got the little standoff insertion and removal tool. It simply pops onto the end of a screwdriver. You pop the screwdriver over the standoff, and then it's going to let you tighten things up into the case. Next, we can set the motherboard into the case, line it up with the standoffs at the back. And then we can secure the motherboard into place with 9 screws from the case accessory box. Okay, next thing to do is get our case cables plugged in, and the header down at the bottom left-hand side of the motherboard is for our HD audio cable. So we'll bring it through the cutout, line it up with the header, and push into place, and then pull the excess cable through to the back. We've got an RGB header down at the bottom of the motherboard, so we'll bring the cable coming from our cases controller through, making sure we've got it lined up the correct way, and push into place. And again, pull the excess cable through to the back. Next to that, we've got 2 USB 2.0 headers, so we'll bring our USB 2.0 cable through. Again, making sure we've got it lined up the correct way, because there is a pin missing on the header and a hole missing on the cable. And push into place, and then again pull the excess cable through to the back. Our front panel connectors are going to go into this header at the bottom right hand side of the motherboard, so we'll bring the cables through the cutout, and you'll notice we've got a whole load of individual cables which have to go into specific pins on this header, so it is important you look at the diagram in the motherboard manual. Okay, so starting off with the bottom row, working from left to right, we've got HDD LED positive and HDD LED negative. So we're going to plug in the cable with the text facing down the way. Next to that, we've got our reset switch. It doesn't matter which way it goes, I'm just going to plug it in with the text facing down the way. Moving up to the top row, we've got power LED positive and power LED negative. And then the 2 pins next to that are for our power switch. Again, it doesn't matter which way it goes in, I'm just going to plug it in with the text facing down the way. And then we can pull the excess cable through to the back. And then our last case cable to plug in is our USB 3.0 header. So we'll bring the cable through the cutout, line it up with the header, and push into place, and then again pull the excess cable through to the back. We're now ready to install our power supply. This is a fully modular power supply. It comes without any of the cables plugged in. I've gone ahead and plugged in the cables that we're going to need. So I plugged in a 24-pin cable, 2 8-pin EPS cables to provide additional power to our CPU. I plugged in 2 8-pin PCIe cables, and I've also plugged in a SATA power cable. Although we're not going to install any SATA drives, the ARGB controller in our case needs SATA power. This is also a smart power supply, so it has a USB cable that plugs into our motherboard, allowing the motherboard to get data from the power supply. You'll also notice I plugged in blue and black cable extensions for our 24-pin cable and our PCIe cables. I haven't plugged them into the EPS cables because once the I/O is installed at the top of the case, we're not going to see them, and cable management will be much easier without them. Final thing to point out, this is our power supply's intake fan, so it's important we install it with the fan facing down the way. So what we can do is set the power supply into the back of the case. We'll just lift the cables up and out of the way and slide the power supply in, and then all the way to the back. And then we can secure the power supply into place before the larger screws from the case accessory bag. Next, we've got our power supply cables to get plugged in. So our 2 8-pin EPS cables are going to go into these headers at the top of the motherboard. So we can bring the cable through the cutout at the top, line it up with the header and push into place. And then it's exactly the same process with the other cable. And then we can just push all the excess cable through to the back. Our 24-pin cable is going to go into this header here, so we'll bring the cable through the cutout, line it up with the header, and push into place. And then you'll notice our cable has some cable combs to help organize the cable. We've also got the USB cable coming from our power supply and another header down at the bottom. So it's just a matter of lining things up and pushing into place, and then again tucking the excess cable through to the back. And then the last cable for us to plug in is the SATA cable coming from our ARGB hub into a SATA cable coming from the power supply. We're now ready to start work on the radiator and fans. So the first thing to do is set the fans onto the radiator. Now I've already lined this up in the case, and this is going to be the back, so we're going to want the cables coming out towards the back. And then we're going to use 8 of these long radiator screws to secure the fans to the radiator. Next thing to do is take a look at the cables coming from each of the fans. So we've got a 4-pin PWM connector and also a 3-pin 5V ARGB connector. So starting off with the PWM connectors, in the pack we get this double splitter cable. So it's just a matter of plugging each of the 4-pin PWM connectors into the double splitter cable. There we go, there's 1 and 2. So that's going to leave us with one 4-pin PWM connector to plug into the CPU fan header on the motherboard. Moving on to the ARGB connectors, we'll notice they have an additional connector on them, which is great because we're going to be able to daisy chain the fans together. There we go. And we're then going to plug this end into an ARGB header on the motherboard. As well, coming from our second fan, we also have the additional header here, which is going to be useful when we come on to look at our pump. So taking a look at our pump, we've got another 3-pin 5V ARGB connector, and again we've got additional header on it we can daisy chain something into. So we're going to be able to plug this end into the connector coming from the fans, and the one header on the motherboard is going to be controlling the lighting from the pump and the 2 fans. We've also got this 3-pin fan connector which we're going to plug into the pump header on our motherboard. So the last thing for us to do before we get the IO installed in the case is to put the bracket onto the pump. And depending on whether you're installing an Intel or AMD motherboard, there's a different bracket. We're installing an Intel motherboard, so we need the one that says Intel on it. So with the Intel facing towards me, I'm just going to set it into here at the top. And then we've got 4 tiny screws to secure it into place. And it's exactly the same process on the other side of the bracket. We're going to slide the bracket into place, and then again with the small screws secured into place. Next we can set our IO into place at the top of the case, and we can screw things into place at the top of the shorter radiator screws. And we can then replace the top dust filter. Next I'm going to pass all the cables coming from our fans through to the back. It's not the easiest for me to show you here, but we have 2 fan headers just to the left of the RAM. The bottom one is for our CPU fan header, and the one above it is our CPU pump header. So I'm going to bring the cable coming from our fans and get it plugged into the CPU fan header. And again, not so easy to show you, but at the top right of the motherboard we've got 2 ARGB headers, so I'm going to bring the ARGB cable coming from the fans and get it plugged into one of the ARGB headers. So getting that plugged in at the top was not easy, and I think if I was doing this again, what I would recommend doing is getting the cables plugged in at the top before actually installing the radiator in the case. Next thing to do is add some thermal paste to the centre of the CPU. You might find this easier with the case lying down on its back. I just do it this way to give you guys a better view of things. So just before we install the IO, there's some plastic protection over the cold plate that we need to remove. And then we can line the bracket up with the CPU. So rather than having the tubes over to the left-hand side of the pump, you need to actually install the pump with the tubes over to the right-hand side. The reason for this is there's a water temperature display in the centre of the IO, and the display is not rotatable. So to have the display up the right way, you're going to need to install it with the tubes over to the right-hand side. Then what we're going to want to do is pass one of these thumb screws with a little spring loaded onto it through each corner, and line it up with a bracket we installed beneath. So that's the thumb screws all on loose now. All I'm going to do is tighten these up one at a time. Next I'm just going to route the RGB cable coming from the pump up to the back of the case, and the 3-pin fan connector I'm going to get plugged into the pump header at the top. There we go, and then just push all the excess cable through to the back. And then we've got some plastic protection on the pump that we can remove. So then we can take the RGB cable coming from our pump and plug it in to the additional header coming from our case fans. We're now ready to install our graphics card, so we're going to need to remove the second and third expansion slot cover from the top. So there's a thumb screw here we're going to need to loosen, and that's going to allow us to slide this bracket out of the way. We can then open the clip in the top PCI expansion slot on the motherboard, and then we can line our graphics card up with the slot, and once we're happy everything's lined up, it's just some firm pressure to the graphics card and it's going to clip into place. We can then resecure the graphics card with the two screws we removed earlier on, and then we can close this bracket and tighten it up again. We can then bring our PCIe cables through the cutout at the bottom, line them up with the graphics card and push into place. And then you'll notice we've got some cable combs on the cables to help organise them. Okay, last thing to do is some cable management so we can get our side panel back on again. So that's the build complete. I've gone ahead and set things up off camera. The reason I've done that is I've made previous build guides using other ASRock motherboards and the process for setting them up is exactly the same. So I'll put a link to that video in the description. If you don't know how to install Windows, the drivers, get the RGB software set up, go into the BIOS, update the BIOS and adjust the BIOS settings, you'll find everything you need in that video. So what I want to do now is take a look at the temperatures. So our 13700K idled at 38 degrees and reached a maximum 98 degrees during a 10-minute IATA64 stability test. The RTX 3070 idled at 35 degrees and reached a maximum of 63 degrees during the stability test. In terms of noise levels, there was an average of 39 decibels at idle and 49 decibels under load. So now I want to come on to any issues I had during the build process, and I think there probably is two main things to point out. I hadn't actually realised that there is a water temperature display in the centre of this AIO, and the display itself is not rotatable, it's fixed. So you need to have the tubes over to the right hand side, and you notice this is different to how I had it set up originally in the build guide. The tubes look better over to the left hand side, but in that position the display was upside down and there's no way to actually rotate it once you've mounted it. So if you are using the same AIO, make sure you've got the tubes over to the right hand side. The other problem that I had during the build was that space at the top of the case, once you've installed the radiator and fans, is really limited. And plugging those cables in at the top was really difficult. So my advice, if you are planning on building in this case with an AIO at the top, would be whatever you do, don't install your radiator and fans until you plugged in all the cables. And if I was doing this again, what I would probably do is install the pump onto the motherboard, get all the cables from the pump plugged in, put the AIO into place, plug in all the fan cables, and then the last thing to do is actually secure things up at the top. The final thing I want to do is give my feedback on the case, because I'm not planning on doing a separate case review. So in terms of the positives, I think the first thing to say is the case is actually quite a good looking case. I really like the lighting bars at the bottom. They're lovely and bright and emit a nice glow on the front. And actually, in terms of the looks of the fans, they look pretty good as well. Although I do think there is a lot missing from this case. I think the biggest problem for me is the fans are sat apart, so there's no way at all to adjust the fan speeds. And in general, when I have been offered these cases to review in the past, sat apart fans, I just say, no, I'm not reviewing them. And I actually hadn't realised these fans were sat apart, otherwise I wouldn't have agreed to review the case. They are actually reasonably quiet at almost 40 decibels at idle, but for me, this is still too loud at idle. and I would like to have some fan control. And in particular, I would like PWM fan control rather than just DC fan control. But sat apart fans are an absolute no as far as I'm concerned. The other things that are missing in this case is there's no front panel Type C. As well as that, there's no rubber grommets. And while you get away with that in most places, I really don't like the large cutout over to the right-hand side of the motherboard in the middle. I think it looks a little bit untidy, and you can see the cables in the back of the case. There was a few other things that I didn't like about the case, and that was the fact that none of the thumb screws are actually captive. They're all non-captive thumb screws, which you have to fully take off. I also wasn't a big fan of the single sheet of mesh on the bottom as a dust filter. Although it is good to see that we've actually got removable PCI expansion slots. They're not actually the breakaway type. So another thing that I wasn't particularly happy with the case, and I did point this out during the build process, was the fact that Gamdias had only secured 6 of the motherboard standoffs to the back of the case, and the other 3 that you would need for a full-sized ATX board, which I think most people will use in this case, were in the case accessory bag. I don't have a big problem with that, I quite understand it, but what I do have a big problem with is not including the standoff insertion and removal tool for actually adding those additional standoffs into place. Either install them all in the case or include the standoff removal and insertion tool as far as I'm concerned. The other side issue I had was I didn't think there was enough cable ties to secure all the cables during cable management at the back, and I did have to add in a few extra cable ties of my own. So hopefully you have enjoyed this build guide. If you have, please remember to give it a thumbs up, and if you're not currently subscribed to the channel, please hit the subscribe button as well. Thanks for watching.